it's not clicking. Ah, terrific. Wonderful. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to Birkbeck, University of London. Welcome to the School of Business, Economics and Informatics, and welcome to Day 3 of Business Week 2014. Business Week is our chance to celebrate our research successes and to share those with a wider audience, and also to bring in distinguished speakers and panelists from around the country and indeed around the world to reflect on current issues. Our theme for Business Week this year is From London to Rio, the business and politics of mega sports events. London, of course, dramatic success in terms of the Olympics and the delivery of that and the legacy thereof. Not quite so sure what the legacy of Rio will be, but certainly for England, I don't think we're going to win. I have a hunch. We won't do it this time. Each of the days, each of the evenings consists of a lecture and then a panel debate, and our keynote speaker for the first part of this evening is Neale Coleman. Oh, sorry, I'm getting it. Neale Coleman, who will deliver the Ronald Tress Memorial Lecture. Ronald Tress was an eminent applied economist and economic advisor of the British War Cabinet during the Second World War. In 1968, he was appointed Master of Birkbeck, and he held that post for 10 years. He did an awful lot to establish Birkbeck on a sound financial footing. He certainly dealt with one of the many crises that Birkbeck seems to attract. We are still here today, so we are celebrating his legacy. He was also, in addition to stabilizing the college, was the founder of the economics department, which is now the Economics, Mathematics and Statistics department, which flourishes to this day. Our speaker is Neale Coleman. Neale is Deputy Chairman of the London Legacy Development Corporation. He has extensive experience in major regeneration projects and chaired a key Olympic group which supported the Olympic Master Plan and outlined planning consent for the Olympic Park. After the lecture, he will be chairing a panel debate. So please welcome Neale Coleman, Economic Regeneration and the Impact of Major Sporting Events. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hang on, I've got to turn my mic on. Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me better now. It's a great pleasure to be here at Birkbeck. One of the best parts of legacy in relation to Olympic Games was those parts of a legacy that we actually delivered before the Games. And we did do that in quite a number of cases. And one case in point has been the involvement of Birkbeck at Stratford, which has now found its sort of final efflorescence in the fantastic new building down there. And I'm really grateful to the work that Birkbeck's done in Stratford and in the area around there, which I think is uniquely amazing in many ways and has really cut new territory out, which I hope we can then deliver in other parts of London as well. And Birkbeck is the first of the new universities we're trying to bring to Stratford. And part of the legacy and the developments that we're looking for is that Stratford won't have no universities. It won't just have one university, but quite soon it will have 4 universities. And we already have Loughborough University scheduled to move in with 1,000 postgraduate students and having signed a lease. And we are at advanced stages of discussion with both UCL and UAL about major campus developments at Stratford. And that's just one, I think, very clear sign of the very rapid and the scope of the change that's happening in this part of East London. I'm actually going to talk pretty much exclusively about London and the London Olympics and the regeneration associated with that, although I'm very happy in the discussion to take that on and to look further at other mega events, both past Olympic Games and other big sporting events, and also at the Olympics to come, whether it's Rio or Tokyo that we're talking about. We're now quite lucky in London because the Games is now seen to have been a success. We've replaced Sydney as a place that everyone comes and talks to about how to do it. And, you know, that's good for us, and it's good for British business, and it creates a lot of opportunities for us, and I think it also creates a lot of opportunities for British academic institutions who've been involved in this. So, flicking quickly on, I think one of the things about the London Games, and I've been lucky enough to be sort of involved in this project since the earliest meetings to talk about London's bid in 2002, and now 12 so years later I'm still doing it, so it's been a great experience for me. But one of the big things which I think was crucially important about London's bid was that we were lucky really to be able to look at developing it and then developing the Games in the context of a new strategic plan for the city. And that's because clearly one of the things that enabled us to make a successful Games bid was the creation of a GLA and the post of Mayor for London. And one of the first things the new mayor had to do was to come up with a new strategic plan for the city, which had completely lacked that throughout the years, the rather peculiar years, in which for various political reasons, which I won't go into, there was no strategic London authority at all, which was a strange state of affairs. And one of the things which people discovered, and really people had almost not noticed this when people set about working on London's strategic plan, was that London's population was growing very, very fast. And it had suddenly turned up from a long period of decline. And that is a process which has very much continued. And this graph shows some of the projections. And actually, there are, clearly there are a range of projections, and some of them suggest that by 2050 we could have as many as 13 million people living in London. Now, one of the big tasks for the plan was plainly to look at ways at accommodating that growth, and that's a big policy debate in itself about what exactly you should do about that in the London context, in the regional context, in the national context. But in fact, both mayors of London have broadly adopted the same approach, fundamental approach to that question, which is the main way in which we should look to accommodate population growth in London, is to accommodate it in London's boundaries, and to do that by developing brownfield sites. And brownfield, the main repository of brownfield sites and brownfield land is in East London. So when you look at the key diagram from the current London plan, you see the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park at the heart of the two big growth areas identified, the Thames Gateway stretching out east and the corridor up to Stansted and Cambridge stretching out north. And so when the British Olympic Association came to see Ken Livingstone towards the end of 2002 and asked him, will you support a London bid for the Olympic Games? He said, and I again was in this meeting, lucky enough to be in this meeting, he said to them, yes, I will do it, and I will support you 100% and do everything I possibly can to win the bid for London, but it has to be a bid in East London, it has to be based in Stratford, and it has to be all about regeneration. And of course, in that first London plan, which identified for the first time a whole series of opportunity areas in London, which were the place we were going to look for new growth, for new jobs, for new homes. The Lower Lee Valley and Stratford was the opportunity area which had the greatest opportunity to provide new homes and new jobs, and policies were set to aim to produce 60,000 jobs in Stratford and the Lower Lee Valley, 60,000 new jobs and 60,000 new homes. And the crucial policy objective was set that Stratford itself should be developed as a major new metropolitan centre for London. And of course that made an awful lot of sense, because one of the things about Stratford is its phenomenal and fantastic connectivity. I always sell it as, and I think it's true, but it's the best connected place in town. It's one of the best connected places in Europe. There are 10 rail lines there at the moment. You're 7 minutes from King's Cross, St Pancras, from Stratford International. We have the Central Line and the Jubilee Line, huge underground arteries. We have the overground service running into Stratford, the DLR and mainline services. And a lot of that was supported, improved and enabled by investment that happened directly due to the Olympics. So the station at Stratford was massively expanded so that it potentially had the capacity not just to serve the games, but to serve future development, residential and otherwise in that area. We saw big investment in the overground and in the DLR, all directly taken out of games budgets. And I think it's actually quite an important point. These were some of the other sort of legacy before the games investments in that we got you know, the overground, the extra trains on the DLR, the new station, all that before the games. And they have actually driven regeneration not just at Stratford, but right across London. If you go to Dalston and see the difference the overground's made there. If you look at what people now call the Ginger Line has done for a lot of regeneration opportunities down in South London. If you even look at, say, the Northern Ticket Hall at King's Cross, which was so important there, that project could well have stalled without the Olympics. And we also have on the horizon the final piece in this connectivity jigsaw, which is in 2018, the Crossrail station opening there. And then we have the most phenomenal connections out to Heathrow, to West London, everything that brings with it. So that's one of the reasons why this story was all possible, and as I say, supported by the games. Now, of course, it wasn't just about growth. At the same time as the opportunity was there, these are the 2007, I'm not quite sure why I'm using 2007 numbers, but I am. But this shows pretty clearly that we were looking here not just at an issue about where you could accommodate growth, but about areas which suffered from severe deprivation that were indeed plainly among the most deprived boroughs in the whole of the country. And the opportunity for the games, this is a pre-games, you know, showing, and it really shows one of the problems that this whole area had. It shows a fundamental sort of problem of severance and lack of connection, in fact. I've talked about the great public transport connection, but when you get above the ground, crossing the Lee Valley was very, very difficult indeed. And you've also got this A12, which still is the most formidable of barriers that we still struggle with in terms of how we're going to actually achieve better connectivity over into Tower Hamlets and so on. But that was really, you know, another part of a regeneration challenge that we faced, this lack of connectivity, this severance and difficulty. And the site, this is the site in 2005. It's pretty extraordinary when you go there today to think it was like this. And you can actually see a lot of industrial activity on the site there. And actually, although it was pretty, you know, it wasn't great environmentally, and there were a lot of heaps of fridges and cars and refuse and all sorts of stuff down there. There were quite a lot of jobs on this site. And one of the tasks we had to do, and which I actually think we did pretty well, was we had to make sure that we actually preserved those jobs, that we found relocation sites for them, that we adequately compensated their owners. And even if we hadn't wanted to do that, we were subject to the most vicious campaign by those landowners to get the best deal for themselves, and they were in a great position to do so. And when I call it vicious, it's what anyone would have done in their position. They ran a very effective campaign, and we had to put together a very ambitious land assembly program, which we did, and we achieved in phenomenal time. We'd cleared the site by 2008 from the position you see in 2005. It cost us £1.3 billion in compensation, land acquisition, relocation, interest on our borrowing. It was all funded through borrowing. It was all done by the LDA. It was all started before the bid. But what it shows is you can do these things when you've got an Olympic Games. You can assemble land on this huge scale which enables you to put in place regeneration programs of a scope and ambition that you simply couldn't consider doing without it. And indeed, we didn't just buy land here, we bought other land lower down the valley, for example, next to West Ham Station, where the GLA is now looking to build another 3,000 homes next to that Jubilee Line station. So the regeneration benefits from being able to act on this scale and move fast and bring land together are phenomenal, and you can't, normally speaking, do that sort of thing. I mean, it was a place you know, which wasn't, you know, there were tyres in the rivers were filthy, and it is extraordinary to see the transformation in what is really a very short part of time. So this is what we said we'd do. It's the sort of thing you put in Olympic bid books, but it was very much at the heart of London's bid, and I think it's actually very important to say that there is no doubt that this promise was very important in London winning. In that, I don't know, people may not remember, but everyone assumed we wouldn't win, and everyone assumed that Paris would win. And frankly, our French colleagues, as I think they would admit today, were very complacent about their bid. They thought they could just say, well, you know, we've got most of it in place. They didn't offer a legacy story. They weren't clear about, they didn't differentiate themselves. They thought they were a shoo-in. And they were very surprised and shocked when they lost. And I can still remember the expressions on their faces when we walked over in Singapore to shake hands with them, and they were hopping mad that day. But, you know, we're now advising Paris on whether they should bid for 2024, which is a nice place to be. I want to say a few things about how we delivered the games, because actually that was quite... that is a strong story. I think we did do a good job on this. And we've obviously tried to carry over quite a lot of the things we did well during the games and in preparing for games delivery into the way in which we're attacking legacy. And also, I think, you know, there's some important lessons here for how to do things and how not to do things in terms of games. And I don't want to be critical about Rio, but they have got problems. And they've got a very different situation there. One of the things which we did very successfully in London was we managed to achieve very close and joined up working between the different tiers of government, between national government, regional government at the GLA, and the local boroughs. And we didn't, I mean, that's not to say we didn't fight, but we managed to keep it under control, and we all worked very much with a common purpose. And although we had all sorts of mechanism in place to resolve differences, we hardly ever needed to use them because everyone was signed up to one team, and we had a very effective staging structure around the role of the ODA, government-sponsored body, but with mayoral safeguards built in to make sure that we had to sign off projects as well as government, a good structure for LOCOG, and with the LDA there to buy the land. And so we were able to achieve a very ambitious program of delivery, and it is astonishingly ambitious when you actually look at it on paper here, but it was achieved, and things that helped to contribute to that were that degree of common working across different tiers of government I've talked about. We were also helped basically by a broad political consensus across the major political parties. Again, that didn't always quite hold, but by and large it did. And we had a pretty regular system in place whereby regularly the key opposition politicians and shadow cabinet members were briefed on pretty much the same basis as cabinet members, except very occasionally. That worked well, and it held together. We had one team, people worked across boundaries very well. We had very strong people from the public sector, a real effort made to go and get extremely high caliber people into the delivery bodies. And I think people were genuinely excited by the project and were willing to do so. We had people coming from all over the world to work to deliver the games. We achieved fantastic continuity in the key individuals who ran the project in LOCOG, in the ODA, in government, in the Mayor's office, ran right the way through the project, which is pretty unprecedented. Normally in delivering an Olympic Games, you have at least 2 major sackings at various stages along the way and restructuring of organisations. We never had that. We stuck to and we delivered on programme. And just in terms of some of the other things we were able to do that we could never have done without the Games, we start here with this power lines undergrounding. Now, this area of London was bedevilled by overhead power lines, which blighted a lot of land, made it undeliverable, and frankly blighted the whole area. It had been an ambition for many, many years to get those power lines underground. When we came back from Singapore, the very first thing we did the next day was to start the process of procuring that work. It was a £380 million project. We buried the power lines 10 metres underground in 10-metre circumference tunnels. It was a phenomenal engineering challenge. It would never have happened without the Olympic Games. Those power lines would still be up there. I mean, in that respect alone, that was a huge driver for future regeneration in this area. When you look at what we actually delivered across, and you remember that slide I showed you a moment ago with the lack of connectivity, a huge amount of spend went into structures, bridges, highways, 20 kilometres of roads, 30 kilometres of tunnels, 30 new bridges over railway lines, over rivers, and that to join up the whole area, make it coherent again. And that scale of investment was massively important to us. People one of the things we're criticised for is the way the budget ballooned, because originally I think we said it was going to cost about 2 or 3 billion, and then we said it was going to cost about 9 billion. I'm afraid this is always the way of Olympic Games, but interestingly, the number in the 3 billion for the Olympic venues actually was very close to the outturn. All the extra money was for infrastructure. It was for doing the bridges, for structures, for utilities, huge extra utility investment. So we put in new utilities across the park, power, gas, sewerage, water, and all of those were sized so that they would deliver not just the Games and the Games venues, but all the development that was supposed to come afterwards. So when you go to a site now that we have on the park, it's fully serviced. There's no money, extra money for utilities. We've done the decontamination. It's all ready to go. And that, again, enables you to push on with the regeneration, with the next stages of activity. So all that was really important for us. And I think, you know, there are a lot of aspects of legacy you can cite. It's a much overused word. I've talked about the transport legacies. I think there was a big sustainability legacy here, and a lot of the things, particularly that the ODA did, they set new targets and achieved new targets, for example, for recycling construction materials. About 98% of the stuff was recycled. They cut new ground in the materials that they used, in using alternatives to PVC, for example, in looking at avoiding the use of HFCs and the like. And a lot of that is carried over into new projects. If you look at health and safety, we're obviously very pleased, and it should be an expectation, but no one actually was killed in a construction accident on our Olympic Games, and that has never been achieved before, unfortunately. But if you look at the construction record of the health and safety record beyond that, and look at major incidents, it was actually as safe to work in construction on the Olympic Park as it was to work in an office in London. And that was achieved through an unremitting focus on health and safety. And that record, again, is a legacy which can be carried over into future construction sites. And we did a lot on local employment, on working with contractors to make sure that unemployed people got jobs and so on. And so there are all those aspects of legacy which were driven, I think, by the effectiveness of the Games delivery teams. Now, one of the other things which, of course, we did, and which the Games made it possible for us to do, was the first stages of the Stratford City development. And I imagine many of you will have been to the Westfield shopping mall at Stratford, which is still Northern Europe's biggest urban shopping mall, at least until Westfield build their extra bits out at Shepherd's Bush, which they're planning to do. But it is bigger, in fact, than the Shepherd's Bush mall. It's unbelievably successful from a commercial point of view. They said they were going to get 20, 25 million people in there, and they've had 40 to 50 million people a year going through there. And that has just changed the whole place, obviously. And an interesting discussion about retail driving regeneration, but it is a very successful commercial scheme. Some people say, and it's one of the things that annoys me a lot, oh, well, this would have happened anyway without the games. It was all, you know, what are you talking about? You didn't need the games to drive regeneration. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. For a start, at the time the games bid went in, this land was owned by an utterly dysfunctional consortium of property developers who used to almost come to blows every time they were in a room together, and we forced them to sort that out. And we would never have been able to do that without the games as a driver. When the crash in capital and property markets happened, Westfield shut down every site they had in the world, apart from this one. And if you talk to them, they will say that this would never, ever have happened without the games. And it really is important to recognise that. They put £1.5 billion of private money into this scheme. They've sold half of it to the Canadian Teachers' Pension Fund. And, you know, before the games, the idea of a Canadian Teachers' Pension Fund investing in this part of town would have been unlikely, to say the least. They created 10,000 new jobs, and they did a great job on job brokerage, and some of their tenants there, particularly John Lewis, who are phenomenal at the way in which they work and recruit local people, the way they recruit disabled people to work in their stores. Brilliant outfit, and fantastic employers to have in the area. And if you walk around that shop and you look at the people who are working in the stores, you can see it's pretty representative of the people who live and work in this part of Newham. So really important to us, and a lot more to come. Planning consent for big further commercial development, more hotels, and a lot more to come there. But that was critical. Obviously opened in advance of the games, had to work very closely with them, couldn't have happened without the games, a big driver for everything that happens there. Now, one of the things which I think we also did well was we were very focused on making sure that we set up some decent structures to manage and deliver legacy. When Boris Johnson was elected in 2008, one of the first things he did was commission a piece of work around the games, and that recommended that we should move very fast to setting up a special purpose vehicle to deliver legacy. He set up a board of advisors to develop those plans, and in 2009 we set up a body called the Olympic Park Legacy Company. There was a Companies Act company, 50-50 deadlocked government and GLA, to run legacy and to get it underway. And we then had a very critical and difficult negotiation involving all the borrowed money that had been to buy the land and all this, to make sure that that company got ownership of the land. Because without ownership of the land on the park, it wouldn't be taken seriously as the driver for regeneration, the single point of contact for developers that we were all talking about. And we were able to do that deal. It was complicated and difficult, but we got it done. And then we had to decide what we were going to do after the games, and we were fortunate enough to be able to persuade the then government to include in the Localism Act, which they put through Parliament immediately they got elected, provision for the Mayor of London to create mayoral development corporations. Up until then, all development corporations had been essentially government bodies. They'd generally been seen as an imposition on local people, a lot of bad feeling in this part of town about the way the LLDC, some of the aspects of the way that had operated. This was a new type of development corporation. It was accountable to the mayor, so it could be seen as locally democratic. We managed to reach agreement with all the local boroughs. Crucially, we had to retain a body that had effective planning powers, and so that we could offer people who were going to come in, invest and develop here a degree of certainty that they would get their planning consents, that they wouldn't get bogged down. It's an area that includes land in 4 different local authority areas and had been bedeviled for ages by difficulties in getting development control consents and in disputes between the boroughs. So that's what we had to do. The area is the park with a broader surrounding area. I'll say a little bit more about that later if I've got time, because that's about making sure we make connections between regeneration on the park and the wider areas there. and very important jobs to do, community engagement development and economic development. But the first thing we had to do was actually to do the work after the Games. And we actually spent, or we have spent, since the Games, another £500 million in post-Games transformation. And we had to fight very hard to get that money. But we always said, and I think if you go to the park today, I think it's borne out, if you don't go and spend that scale of money on the work that needs doing in the park, you won't get the quality park that you need as a central part of legacy. I'll whip through our standard mission-y and objective slides and come on to a few things about where we've got to now with the park. So here's our transformation program that I talked about. And one of the things we really wanted to do, which hasn't always successfully been achieved in other games, was to get things reopened quickly. We have these huge crowds, and the Games was a great triumph from many points of view. And in the last week, we came under this huge pressure of leave the park open, let more people come in, leave it open for another month. And I'm delighted to say we managed to resist that pressure, because we said, look, the important thing is not that, it's getting it reopened, and we've got to clear the place, and we've got to get on with it, and otherwise it'll be a terrible waste of time and money. So we got straight on with the transformation program, and that meant that just 1 year later, we were able to open the north of the park again and the Copper Box Arena, literally on the anniversary of the opening of the Games. And we were able to run a series of big concerts and other events, which meant that we got 700,000 people into the Olympic Park a year after the Games. And that was really important, I think, to demonstrate momentum and that we were really pushing on. This year, we've obviously done a lot more. We've managed to reopen the South Park. We've reopened all the remaining venues apart from the stadium, and I'll say a little bit more about them in a moment. One of the things that pleases me most about what we've managed to do so far is actually, we've been helped quite a lot by the weather, I have to say. We have had some fantastic number of visitors through the park to early events and to whatever. So we've had nearly 1 million people in the park already since April visiting it, well ahead of our forecasts. The children's playgrounds, a lot of the fountains, the restaurants in there and whatever, really drawing local people in, and it is now seen very much by local people as a fantastic amenity and being used like that. And we haven't obviously finished some of the stuff we're going to do there. Planted 5,000 new trees, we've done a huge amount of work in there, built new cafes, new facilities, shrunk bridges, done a lot of work in there. Coming on I mean, we've also got a fantastic program of events as well. I should just add that. This year we've got this Invictus Games, which Prince Harry's organising for wounded ex-servicemen, which I think will be a big event. We do National Paralympic Day every year. We'll get 20 or 30,000 people to that. We've already had the FINA World Diving Series in the pool when we opened it. We've got the European Swimming Championships next year. We've got the World Cycling Championships in the Velodrome next year. We've got the World Paralympic Tennis Championships in the tennis venue this year. In 2016, we've got 5 Rugby World Cup. 2015, we've got 5 Rugby World Cup games in the main stadium. And in 2017, we've got the World Athletics Championships, the 3rd biggest sporting event in the world, and the World Paralympic Athletics, the first time those events have ever been held together. And I think, with a bit of luck, that London 2017 won't quite be London 2012, but it should, we hope, bring back a lot of the same vibe and the same memories that we had then. I mean, the stadium is an interesting, the stadium is one of the big legacy problems. Because nobody needs a 60,000 athletics or track and field stadium. You just don't need one. And you can't fill it other than 3 or 4 times a year. So you have a problem. We hope, solved that problem. We have reached a concession agreement with West Ham United to play Premier League football. We hope it'll be Premier League football anyway, from 2016-17. And we are now having to spend quite a lot of money again on this stadium. So we're probably going to spend the thick end of 200 million quid on the stadium, because what we're doing to it is we are completely changing the seating. We're taking the whole of the lower bowl seating out. and we're fitting a new movable and retractable seating system in there that enables us both to do athletics and to move the seats for football, to move them back again to do a concert, and to build a lot of flexibility into the stadium. Now, a lot of people say to us, well, why didn't you do that originally when you built the stadium? And the answer to that is, when we were finalising the design of the stadium, we were very worried about delivery speed, and we were way over budget. And the last thing we wanted to do was add another £100 million into the cost. And we had no football club that was willing to offer us serious money. We had a sort of letter from West Ham that didn't amount to anything. And of course, if we had done any sort of deal with West Ham, we would have then have got caught up with the fact that they went bankrupt when the Icelandic banks collapsed. And it would have been a complete disaster for us. So although it seems a bit counterintuitive, I think we did the right thing at the right time. We do need to do the retrofit. We do need to make it sustainable in the long run, so we have to have an anchor tenant in there. I think this works. I hope it works. We did a fantastic athletics event in there in 2013. We're doing the conversion works in an interesting way because we want the Rugby World Cup in there, so we're doing most of the work. We're demobilising our contractor. We're getting athletics event and rugby in there. We're then getting them out. We're then remobilising our contractor, finishing the work, and getting West Ham in there in 16-17. And that's, of course, the thing we haven't got open at the moment. Oh, what's happened? I'll press on. I'm not sure. Have I pressed something, but I shouldn't have pressed? I did. Two other venues. We had the Copper Box open. It's a great venue. We've done a good deal with Greenwich Leisure to run these. The arena, the Copper Box, actually makes money. It's a nice venue. You can use it for concerts. You can use it for events. 7,500 seats. There's no arena this size in London. Got basketball team there. We've got a big gym in there. We've got a whole range of events going on in there. And our deal with Greenwich Leisure, we give them both facilities, and they actually overall pay us money, which is fairly remarkable because pools cost you a fortune normally. So that enables us to run the aquatic centre effectively. Aquatic centre, if you've been in there, it's fantastic, brilliant building, amazingly well used. We had 8,500 visitors the first weekend. We've had 200,000 people in there the first 2 months. We've got 3,000 school kids locally learning to swim in there. There's a huge queue to get in the kids' inflatable sessions. You have to book weeks in advance. We had FINA diving in there. We've got Tom Daly training there with his new coach. It's really going beautifully. I mean, it's a great venue, and we're really pleased with it. Velodrome, I haven't got a slide about it, but we've opened that. 4 cycling disciplines in there, the indoor velodrome, a road cycling circuit, BMX and mountain bike trails. Again, swamped with people, 100,000 in the first few weeks. Again, you've got a queue for a long time. A lot of corporate events happening in there. It's going really well. And some big elite events coming up in there as well. So very pleased with how the venues. We've just opened in June the hockey and tennis facilities, and they're going really well as well. Another big thing we did, obviously, the village. This was supposed to be privately financed. It was perhaps the biggest crisis we had of all during the game's delivery. It's supposed to be privately financed, then we had the crash. It clearly wasn't going to be able to be privately financed. The state had to step in and effectively take the risk and fund the delivery of this village. We had 17,000 athletes in there during the games. We've now got 2,800 housing units, half of them affordable, consortium of housing associations, half of them private rented, and we managed to build it on reasonable cost. We took all the risk on that, and then we sold it to a consortium of the Qataris and Delancey. We sold the freehold to the British Property Company. They have a consent to build another 2,000 units there. I think it was a good deal. Sometimes, and the Daily Mail keeps on saying we sold it to the Qataris cheap. I mean, they were offered at least 100 million more than the next bid. So, I mean, it's just, you know, the sort of thing we put up from the Daily Mail. I think, you know, if you go there now, it actually feels like a real place now, and a quality place. The quality of construction, the quality of the units is very high. They're flying off the shelf for private rented offers. It's the first time we've done a really big institutionally funded private renting scheme in London. At the moment, barring sort of state intervention in the market, it's the only way to drive quicker housing delivery in London. We're hoping to do more of that. We've got a great academy school there, big sixth form, 1,800 places, going really well, fantastic facilities, always built into the scheme, and a terrific health centre, great primary care group in there, and some exciting other people in there. We've got UCL partners in there doing some interesting research and other work, and some other people doing sports injuries and so on. Now, one of the things that having these legacy bodies set up enabled us to do, we set ourselves 2 targets, both of which we actually managed to achieve, which was that before the Games, we should have a planning consent for all the legacy development, and that we should have hired or procured our first developer for the first new housing scheme, which was the scheme at Chobham Manor, which you can see there. And this was a planning consent that we got, and essentially this can be characterised, I suppose, that we were doing infill housing between the Olympic venues. You can see what we're there, 7,000 new homes, a lot of family housing, 35% affordable, and so on. This is the Chobham scheme. It's on site now. We had 30 people who queued overnight to try and buy the first units. It is all, I think, going to be sold probably to UK, on the UK market. It's not being marketed overseas. And we will get people moving in there in 2015, 2016. It's a very nicely designed scheme, a lot of family housing, very different scale to the Olympic Village, and I think it will look great. It's a terrific scheme. Taylor Wimpey, who are not necessarily always known for brilliance of their I probably shouldn't say that, but they're not always known for that, have actually done a really, really good job here, and we're delighted with what they've done. On the west side of the park, we've also now decided to really push housing delivery and to push private renting. So we brought forward a big scheme, and we brought it forward compared with our original plan, so that it delivers 6 years early, 1,500 new homes, some interesting employment space, retail, leisure, 2 new schools. Delighted to say we've got the funding for the school. We're having a Mossbourne Academy primary school, which Hackney are building, which will be in here. And we're also having a free school, which we have to have if we want the money for it, which will go on the stadium site and will be another big all-through school. So we're putting the schools in as well. This is also, this is great, I hope. This is the other big legacy problem. What do you do with the broadcast centre? Olympic broadcast centres are pretty bespoke. You don't need an Olympic broadcast centre. They're very funny buildings. They have huge studio heights, and they sometimes get turned into conference centres, which lose lots of money. And otherwise, they generally get knocked down. We were very lucky in that we were able to do a deal very fast. So LOCOG moved out of here at the end of January 2013. And we did a deal with BT Sport that they would come in and do their new sport television channels out of here. And they had to start broadcasting at the end of May 2015. And we had no planning consents or anything in place. Now, this was achieved, and the credit goes, frankly, to BT, who were amazing, just extraordinary in what they did here. And the guy who ran it, who used to work for the BBC, said this took the BBC 6 years to do, and we've done it in 5 months. And I can well believe that. And to have them in as an anchor tenant there, they've got the biggest studio in Europe in there. They're doing all their television channels out of there. It's really brilliant. And then we've sold the lease to a partnership of Delancey again and Infinity, who are a big data center provider. And they're going to put a huge data center in here, which will underpin the economics of the whole scheme. This is where Loughborough are going with 1,000 postgrads. We've got the local FE college going in there as well. We've also got Wayne McGregor's dance company, Random Dance, going in there. They're going to build the 2 biggest dance studios in Europe in the broadcast centre. And we've got potentially some very exciting other tenants. Big focus on business, technology, media, education and data. There was a piece in which Bloomberg put out today saying, is the Olympic Park the next Silicon Valley? Well, maybe not quite, but we do think we will get 7,500 jobs out of this. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting people wanting to move into this building, and again, 150 million quid's worth of private money going in. So that is something which we've frankly been quite lucky with, but we took the opportunity and we're very hopeful for that. So I'm probably going on a bit too long, but I'm drawing towards the end now. We've now changed our approach. You saw the scheme we got planning permission before. I think because the games were so successful, because there was genuinely, I think, a change, frankly, I really believe in global perception of this place, because people could see that it was 7 minutes from central London. I mean, we shifted 250,000 people an hour on the trains out of here during the games. We had one train coming in and out every 45 seconds. And it is amazingly connected, and it's right in the heart of London. It's really in central London. We thought we wanted to look at how we could perhaps use some of the development land that we had, not just to build residential, not just to do housing, but to build some big economic drivers that would really drive growth and jobs in this part of town. It's what the local boroughs want, it's what local people say they want. And that's why we came up with this approach, which is very much around creating, designing, making, and you can see how that links in with what I've just said about the Here East project, where we're really already doing that. And the precursors of this, the Great Exhibition of 1851, which led, of course, to the developments in South Kensington, the Science Museum, the V&A, the Natural History Museum, Royal College of Art, Imperial College, the Festival of Britain, which left the South Bank, and we're trying to sort of do something a bit similar. They're quite good precursors to have, actually. And that's where we are now. We were lucky enough to be able to get very early expressions of interest and partnership from UCL and from the V&A. From UCL for the potential to build a new campus out in the park to the south of the stadium, 100,000 square metres of development over time, very large development. They have no land in Bloomsbury. They can't expand in Bloomsbury. They need to expand. This is a great opportunity for them. They have Imperial going out to Earls Court, King's going to Canada Water. It's a very strong partnership. We're very excited by it and working closely with them. And then the V&A, the idea of V&A East, a new, I hope, edgier and slightly different museum, which they will put on our waterfront site, a fantastic site we have there with big waterfront on the River Lee. We also have now a very mature discussion with Sadler's Wells about them putting their new dance theatre in there. We're talking to UAL about them moving all London's fashion colleges to that site, and possibly another college on the Lend-Lease site there. So we're delighted we've got a lot of government support for this. It's included last autumn's statement in the National Infrastructure Plan. We're working on it very hard. We're driving a very aggressive timetable. We're working with the institutions. We hope to have a full outline business case in with government by September, and we hope to get a big announcement, if all goes well, of funding in the autumn statement this year to push on with design, fundraising and procurement next year and to get construction underway in 2016. I'm going to skip over that one. So a lot of ideas about future growth. Although we're doing less housing on the park, we think that what we're trying to do there will drive housing delivery on the other sites there are in this area. There's already 20,000 units in this area consented, capacity for at least 5,000 more. We're going to see a big rise in population. The Olympicopolis plans do drive a lot more job creation. An extra 10,000 direct jobs and many more in local supply chains, potentially in the period to 2030, an extra 5.2 billion in GVA, an extra 100 million in tax income every year. Clearly the case that we have to make in support of trying to get government funding here. Very excitingly, from my point of view, and in many ways an absolutely key to this, is one of the big things about Stratford is the site that sits between the shopping mall and the park. It's called the International Quarter. It's owned by a consortium of Lend-Lease and London and Continental Railways, and it has consent for millions of square feet of commercial development. And in terms of making this a real metropolitan centre, getting that commercial development away, making Stratford another London office quarter, in the same way that Canary Wharf and South Bank are, is really key to the overall aspiration. We are absolutely thrilled that we have now got 2 big tenants. They are public sector tenants, but none the worse for that. So we've managed to persuade the Financial Conduct Authority to move its headquarters from Canary Wharf to Stratford, 3,000 jobs with that. And we have got Transport for London moving a lot of their headquarters staff, 2,500 of them, to a new office on the International Quarter. So by 2017, we will have 2 huge new office blocks out there. We will have 5,500 new jobs. And I believe that actually the rest of that commercial development will fly with those as anchors there. And I know that a lot of people, both public and private, are talking to Lend-Lease. And that is an absolutely key piece in the jigsaw. So, I mean, I could bang on about lessons, but I don't think I will. Just ending on this, I mean, I just, you know, I mean, one of the things about this is when you go back to what I said at the beginning about the plan and 60,000 new jobs, which was the aspiration in the London plan in 2002, actually, when you add up the numbers that we've already got, the 10, 12,000 from Westfield, the 5, 7.5 from here east, the 5.5 that are already going in to the commercial section with probably another 20 or 25,000 to come there, the Olympicopolis jobs, 10 to 30,000. We're actually, you know, on the cusp in that very short period of time of delivering, over-delivering on what would have seen extremely optimistic job projections at the time and really transforming this area from an employment point of view. And I would say, and I think it's true, none of that would have happened without the Olympic Games. So this is just 3 quick slides which we've redone the A to Z. So this is what it used to be like. That's what it was like at Games time. And that's what you get when we've finished.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've just heard Neale Coleman give an excellent and very stirring account of the magnificent achievements of the Olympic Games and the legacy thereof. I think he's given us a thrilling story of brilliant organization, overcoming insuperable obstacles and achieving wonderful things, explaining the interaction of the role of transport and other infrastructure, decontamination, retail development, John Lewis's and the Westfield Shopping Centre, and the fantastic success of that, the enormous number of jobs that have been created, and so on. 5,000 trees planted, all the rest, the greenness of the whole thing. It all sounds fantastic, and one's easily carried away by it all, I think. The only question that I have to say remains in my mind, as a boring old economist, is, was it worth the £9 billion? It's fantastic what you can do if you've got £9 billion to spend. And indeed, one of the things that Ken Livingstone said at the start was he couldn't care less about the Olympic Games. He wasn't at all interested in 3 weeks of sport. For him, the whole deal was that this would unlock billions of pounds from the government to regenerate Stratford. And that was the entire game as far as he was concerned. Of course, Tessa Jowell, also in 2002, famously remarked that they thought it was a good deal at £2.4 billion, but if they'd known it was going to cost £9 billion, they'd never, ever have put in a bid. So I think there are interesting questions. I think Neale has given us a thrilling story about the successes of the legacy, and obviously it's very important to extract absolutely as much as possible for the future from all this public spending. But I guess there are wider questions about the value of Olympic Games in general. And I think the questions on the examination paper, the questions that were set for this business week were questions about the ability of the Olympic Games to act as a catalyst for future economic development. What kind of effects can the BRICS look forward to from Olympic Games and other major sporting events held there? And sort of the whole wider question about the value of investing these huge amounts of money into major sporting events. So one thing about these things is because it's all so exciting and thrilling, you get the feeling that people, when the Olympic Games or the FIFA, the World Cup is mentioned, people lose all sense of proportion and stop looking at things in a hard-headed, rational kind of way. Everyone simply gets too excited by what's going on. And I think, apart from celebrating the wonderful achievements of the Olympic Legacy Corporation and the rest, the point of the discussion, I think, the discussion to take in these wider questions about the value for money of the whole thing. And to that end, we have now a brief panel discussion before this session ends at soon after 7:30 this evening. And we have three distinguished and expert panelists who are going to contribute to the panel discussion along with Neale Coleman. We have, excuse me, I've got Professor Maurice Roach from the University of Sheffield. We have Professor Chris Grattan from Sheffield Hallam University, and Stephen Gifford, who was formerly the Director of Economics at the Confederation of British Industry. So I'd like to invite these three gentlemen to take to the stage. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us for this evening's panel discussion. And so it's a bit of a squeeze on our on our stage. But could I we begin the proceedings by asking each of our three panelists if they would care to make a brief statement expressing their own views about these matters and responding to Neale's excellent speech. I have to say, I've forgotten to do one thing, which I should say. Neale, thank you very much for your fantastic speech. Can we all give Neale another round of applause? Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, but gentlemen, if you'd like to begin, shall we start with Stephen? Would you like to say a word or two for a couple of minutes?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll just give some brief thoughts on the questions. So I very much agree with the sentiment expressed around economic regeneration of East London. It's clear that there's a powerful story. The look and feel of that area has changed dramatically, and I think there's a powerful story around there. But I suppose a lot of the benefits that were identified are much wider than just the East London regeneration. So I worked on an evaluation of the impacts and the legacy of the Games for about 3 years for DCMS. And we looked into the sporting legacy, the economic legacy, East London generation legacy, and the social impact. So on the question of whether the Olympics produces economic impacts, I think it's more sort of questionable. So it's clear that there was a massive construction impact. There were lots of jobs created, and there was increased numbers of tourism into this country, although the number actually fell in 2012, although they spent more. So there was a very significant economic impact, but then you have to ask, why wouldn't there be if you spent 9.3 billion and also 2 billion of commercial from low-cog? So there would necessarily be a large economic impact. And I think also the questions around wider benefits such as focus on export promotion, inward investment, a bigger, a wider tourism legacy, and changing the brand of the UK are certainly much more questionable economic benefits that I think the evidence is yet to be realised. So on the whole, I think the actual regeneration of East London is the most powerful legacy of the Olympics. Whether that would have happened otherwise is the key question. I think it would have, but it may have taken 50 or 100 years to form the same benefit. So Olympics was certainly a catalyst for change in that area, and there was a patchwork of land there that was impossible to realise and bring together. So in that sense, I think regeneration has definitely been a massive change in East London. You can just see when you visit there, the look and feel of the place has changed. The economic transformation is just beginning, and there's many years to go, many decades here to go. It's just beginning. I think when you look at the land values of around the park, they're not actually showing yet in terms of increased land values compared to other parts of London. All land values across London are increasing, so there's not yet a sort of economic legacy in terms of monetary value of land outside the immediate vicinity of the park. But I expect that will come, and that will take another 10, 20 years, and there'll certainly be a massive economic regeneration of East London that will result from it. So on the whole, questions about many of the legacy benefits, but it's certainly a very positive story for East London.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So, Professor Maurice Roach, if you'd like to offer your thoughts.
Well, I think I'm a sociologist, and so I'm looking at this from outside of the maybe perspective of the economics perspective that you're all bringing to this. And one of the things that I did some years ago, back in the 80s, in fact, was realize how important big events could be for cities, given that in Sheffield we launched in those days on the World Student Games adventure, which didn't end hugely well in 1991. So it's been very interesting here this evening hearing about this incredibly impressive project from people who are intimately involved with it. In a way, surely a project which is going to have a much more positive outcome than the one that occurred back then in Sheffield. But what that at least did to me was suggest that people involved in urban planning and urban policy making quite often are not hugely aware of what exactly it is that they've bitten off, and can they chew it when they get into these big projects. And that's what actually motivated me in those days, in the 1980s, to write a book called Mega Events and Modernity. And what I tried to do there was to step back into history and into the development of British society, and to a certain extent American society and French society also, to look at how these big events had shaped the capital cities and major cities of these societies. So it was very much a kind of survey that I was trying to undertake then. And that was published in 2000. And in the course of doing that, I was struck with the overlap between two very different kinds of genres of great event. One, the Olympic Games type event that we've heard about, and secondly, the World's Fair type of event. The most recent one of these that we've had is in Shanghai. 2010, 73 million people attended that expo, to give some idea of the scale and the continued relevance of these kinds of big events. And I was very interested to hear what Neale had to say about the thinking involved in the Olympic Park development, namely that models and paradigms from these other kinds of cultural, non-sporting events are also being used and considered in the analysis and development of the Olympic legacy project. More recently, I've been looking at mega events in China to a certain extent and trying to understand something about the relevance of staging big events for these cities that are changing at a unprecedented, historically unprecedented scale and pace in that part of the world. So in a way, mega events perform functions of all kinds, not only economic functions, and I guess it will be an interesting discussion to have as to whether the experience we've had here and are having here and look forward to having here in London is readily transferable to other parts of the world, for instance, China. So I'll leave my comments open at the moment on that.
Okay, thank you very much. So Professor Chris Grattan, would like to...
I'll just follow on from Maurice about talking about Beijing a little bit, because as academics, I was more involved with Beijing than I was with London, because most of the economic analysis tended not to go to academics but to consultancies. But we are a sort of consultancy. We run a research centre where we do measure economic impacts of major events, but not the Olympics or not the World Cup. We did do the European Championship in 1996, and that's where we started doing this event work. And the paradigm at that time was we have events in order to make a difference to people who don't live in the host city or the host country, but for everybody else's impressions of this country, whether it's the tourist image or whether it's bringing visitors from overseas to spend money here and generate an economic impact. And it was all about having the event to bring people from outside or change the opinions of people from outside. But in 2004, John Crompton, an English sports economist working in America, was trying to explain a different phenomenon. Why do American cities vote taxpayers' money to build massive stadia to profit-making leagues such as the NFL, baseball teams, so on? And 90% of American professional team sports have had a new stadium built for them since the 1980s, with taxpayers' money, usually profitable league. And he said, it's not because of economic impact, it's because of psychic income. It's what people inside the cities, inside the host communities, have benefit, this psychic income, the psychological well-being effect. In America, he was talking about the Green Bay Packers. He says, without the Green Bay Packers, nobody, even in America, would have heard about Green Bay. And I've tried to sort of adopt that sort of psychic income approach to things like the Olympics. And I've done it with China, because everybody said, Beijing is putting the Olympics on to make an impact outside, just that old economic impact paradigm. Yet we've done work in China last year, sorry, not last year, 2012, in May and June, just before the London Olympics, and last year, in combination with Shanghai Sports University, asking the Chinese what they thought about the Beijing Olympics in 2012 and in 2013, 4 years, 5 years on. And there's a massive legacy of this psychic income effect. When faced with questions, were you proud of that China hosted the Olympic Games? 90% agreed or strongly agreed. 90%. Only 2% had any sort of disagreement. The rest was, we don't know. But there's a huge impact on Chinese people, and these weren't in Beijing. They were either in Shanghai or in Jinan or Qufu, and only one person in the whole of the two samples had been to the Beijing Olympics. But the effect, and these were young people, these were students in one of the samples, the effect 4 years on was still huge. And that's what I think happened with London. I think it wasn't the economic impact. I've just said there were less tourists in 2012. They spent more. But I'll just finish with one quote. The Sunday Times, on August the 12th, the day the Games finished, the Sunday Times was very critical of spending $9.3 billion on the Olympics. Sunday Times, in its editorial, said, if we can find something else next year which we can spend £9.3 billion and makes us feel this good as a nation, then let's do it. And I think that just goes to show what impact those games had for 3 weeks. Not all this economic impact and legacy that's coming now, but there is a legacy in terms of the psychological well-being that the Olympics generated. And that was what nobody really expected. Certainly the media didn't, the Sunday Times didn't, but you could see it was there.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. What I propose now is that we throw the discussion open to everyone, and we have and collect a couple of questions from comments from the floor, and we have a couple of roving mics which will go around, and perhaps we collect a couple of questions and then let the panel answer.
Judith Mayhew Jonas, I was involved to a large extent on the LDA, and then later on with London and Partners. The reason why London is the only Olympic city to have kept its tourism steady. Every other Olympic city has dropped its tourism. And we, as the Economic Development and Promotional Company, knew that was our problem. So we actually succeeded in not losing tourism in that year, because everyone thinks it's going to be a rip-off because it's an Olympic year, and therefore they go somewhere else. So actually that was a success. It mustn't be seen as critical. And I think what was really important was in the surveys we did afterwards, with people coming in from outside, they got a better view of the British. We have an image worldwide, well, I'm not British, but you know, the Brits have an image worldwide of being slightly frosty, Londoners aren't that welcoming, etc., etc. And that changed, that image changed over that Olympic period. And it's had a knock-on effect on tourism since. So there are some soft things that have come out of this, which have actually made the tourism extremely good. And I think we all supported it because we knew no government likes spending money in London. And yet London needs its infrastructure renewed every now and then just to provide economic benefit to the rest of the country. It was an infrastructure project with some games attached. It happened to be so well managed that the games were superb and there were tremendous benefits flowing from it. But don't forget there was a cultural Olympiad that went along as well. And to the point of the Beijing Cultural Olympiad, the Royal Ballet opened that, and 500 million people watched Sleeping Beauty on the opening night because we took a production team and sent it out all over Chinese television. And the feel-good factor in China was very largely down to television and the way in which it was portrayed on the screen. And we also got that feel-good factor through it being projected and people thinking, well, the Brits aren't so bad after all.
Thank you, Dame Judith. And the gentleman in the middle, in the jacket, has a question. Yeah, Neil, could you just wait for the mic? It's just on its way to you, and then you will be recorded for posterity.
Some Leyton Orient fans are concerned that the West Ham United, by moving into the Olympic Stadium, which I think is about a mile from the Leyton Orient ground, that might result in the extinction of that club, which wouldn't be a very good legacy. Do you think those concerns are ill-founded, and what would you say to a Leyton Orient fan concerned for the future of their football club?
Well,
just a second. Let's take one more question, then we've got three. And there's a gentleman on the back row who's got the microphone, he's all ready to
Yes, hello.
ask a question. Sir.
At the moment, the government can still borrow for 50 years at roughly a 0% real rate of interest. So surely that means the bar for achieving a positive net present value in terms of the yield on the scheme is very low. So I had hoped that all of this 9 billion actually will achieve a positive net present value. And my thought is, but maybe the government should be investing a lot more infrastructure projects, given that borrowing costs are so cheap.
Okay, well, shall we go back to our panel, to gents? What would you like to? How would you like to respond? Neil, perhaps you'd like to kick off.
Shall I do Leyton Orient? I mean, I've always found the Leyton Orient argument rather odd because, on the one hand, it's said that because West Ham are moving closer to them, it is an awful lot closer, it will destroy the club. And then on the other hand, the answer to that is for them to move into the same stadium as West Ham. And that just seems to me a completely illogical position. And I think they actually, I mean, I'm an Arsenal fan, so I shouldn't perhaps, but I mean, I know a lot about London football. I've been to Leyton Orient many times. I don't think West Ham moving into the Olympic Stadium will make any fundamental difference to Leyton Orient's viability. I think what will make a difference to Leyton Orient's viability is who owns it and how much they invest in the club. Leyton Orient has a completely different fan base from West Ham's. And I think if it remains there in that part of town, as I think it probably will, although, you know, it's not a secret that people involved in the club have been looking at other places for it to move, and were doing that before West Ham did the deal there. I think it has a secure future, provided that it gets a reasonable level of investment from its owners, in the same way as any club in that league does. So I very much hope Orient won't be affected. I don't see why they should. I've never seen why they should. And I didn't think it made any sense for Leyton Orient to play in the Olympic Stadium, because, you know, it's a bit like Queen of the South playing at Hampden Park. I don't see how you get any atmosphere or anything around Leyton Orient if they've got, say, 6,000 people a maximum watching them in the Olympic Stadium. So I've always been a bit baffled by the Orient argument. I very much hope they will survive, and I think they will.
Chris, would you like to?
Well, as a Port Vale supporter whose ground is a few miles from Stoke City, Port Vale and Stoke City are exactly the same as West Ham and Leyton Orient. And Port Vale got promoted last season from the League Two, and for the last few games there was 14. There's normally 5,000 or 6,000 like Leyton Orient, but there's 14,000 in their games near the end of the season for promotion. No, Leyton Orient will be fine. That's the way football fans are related to a specific team. I went back to Port Vale, which is nowhere near I live now, near in Sheffield. But basically, I went back to watch their final matches because I'm a Port Vale fan. I never go to Stoke. It isn't just success that pulls fans in that direction. If Leyton Orient get promoted next season and get successful, the crowds will increase as well. There's no problem, I don't think.
Maurice?
Yeah, I've got nothing to say at all about Leyton Orient. I'm terribly sorry. I think there's a tendency in the sport world to think in very self-regarding ways, and that goes for each and every sport and for the sport world in general. So it's interesting that you've got a business week here which is concerned with major sport events and not more, you haven't cast it more generally. And I mean, as I say, for instance, when I started looking into this whole events area, I really did try to have a look across the piece at cultural events as well as sport events. And it's quite clear that there are tremendous linkages which always come through for sport, for the staging of sport events. And Judith pointed to them in her comments about 2012. And we could add to that the opening ceremony and the televising of all of this. These are cultural phenomena, and they're not paid enough attention, it seems to me, if we just address these events purely as sport events. So that would be one message I would want to try to convey, that sense of it's important to put these other cultural dimensions of these sport events into the proper planning perspective. So that's one thing I want to say. Secondly, I think on the issue of infrastructure, it was interesting that just recently we've had George Osborne's speech about the North, which has pleased me greatly. Back in the 80s even, we were thinking about this business of, if you lay Los Angeles sideways, you cover Liverpool to Hull. You know, we have a kind of an interurban area up there, and we have not got very good infrastructure connectivity there. And now, here we are in 2014, people are starting to talk about this, and I'm very glad to hear there's an economist back there who's prepared to say we might be able actually to think about this in a way which doesn't increase the national debt hugely. So it could be a positive thing. So it's one of the best things I've heard George Osborne say for a long time, I'll have to say.
Stephen, would you like to?
So just to build on that infrastructure point, I think it clearly having an MPV greater than 0 for Olympic venues would have been, I don't know what it was, but I think the question has to be, how big do you want your NPV? So Infrastructure is very good for long-term economic growth. So the question is whether you spend it on stadium or whether you spend it on transport, for example, or education. So I think that's the important question around infrastructure. I'm very much a supporter of the Olympics in terms of it having a feel-good effect. I think, you know, it's a great thing. People really enjoyed the sports. It's very much forward, positive in terms of well-being. But we shouldn't try and make it something it isn't in terms of creating economic benefits and MPV greater than zero. When, if you wanted that, then you wouldn't spend it on those sort of big stadiums. You'd spend it on something else, education or something, building schools or something. That's what you build it on. So I think it should be sold on feel-good factor, as that lady said. I think the tourism was very well handled. Clearly, many other Olympic cities had falls in tourism. I think overall, I think the message is that each host city is very different. So London is about regeneration. I think, you know, Barcelona was slightly different as well. You know, China was about putting itself on the map, and that's why you see Middle Eastern countries like Qatar or others wanting to bid for Olympic Games and bid for the World Cup, because they want to change their image. They want to change their brand and be seen on the world stage. I'm not sure whether that would have been the same thing for London. London already has a global brand, already has a very good brand. So I think it very much comes down to which host city, what are the peculiar messages around that host city that the Olympic Games can bring and mega events can bring.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you. I think we've got time for another round of questions. The roving microphones are roving around. Would anyone like to... There's a gentleman here, this bright red tie, would like to ask a question. And gentlemen, yeah.
I find it quite interesting. There's a tendency when you're talking about the social impact and the economic impact to think of them very distinctively. But actually, could we not roll them together? Because when I think about Stratford, I now have a positive image in my mind, mostly because of that Saturday evening when we won 3 golds. And I'm quite interested, Neale, if you think that actually there's a bit of a debt that needs to be paid there to the sporting bodies, and especially the elite sporting bodies, and how they delivered those fantastic moments that actually mean we now have positive thoughts in our mind when we think of Stratford. And actually, do you think that's had an impact in terms of how much people have uptaken on the property side as well afterwards?
And we have another, thank you very much. And we've got another question towards the back, the gentleman in the purple shirt.
I guess,
Sir.
sorry, 2 related parts. One's already been touched on. When we look at something like this, we can very easily categorise the benefits of spending 9 billion. But I never seem to see any sort of sensible analysis of, call it the alternate benefits. So if you'd gone and taken the 9 billion and, I don't know, just cut business taxes, you know, give deductions for investments or taxes on jobs, is there ever really any serious analysis, you know, as an alternative done? Or in practice, do we have sort of economic cases that are really built to justify emotional decisions that have already been taken? And I suppose the second question relates to that, which is that when I see sort of, you know, the benefits of something like this or sort of the fast rail links, a lot of it seems to be around the quantification of spin-offs, which are somewhat amorphous and sort of hard to pin down, largely because there often doesn't seem to be much by way of direct benefit. When we do the comparisons with sort of, you know, something like cutting taxes, where there's a real hard benefit, do we put the same analysis of the spin-off benefits into the alternate use as we do into sort of charismatic projects?
Do we have a third question, ladies and gentlemen? Lady here. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's probably a question for Neale more than anyone else. Young people were very much at the heart of the Games when the Games were won in Singapore. And I'm just wondering how you're carrying on that legacy in terms of engaging that future generation in the growth boroughs, given the amount of jobs that are going to be created that you show, which is hugely impressive. How are you actually ensuring that that is benefiting the future generation from those growth boroughs and that it's local jobs generated for local people?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just to answer the question about cost-benefit analysis. I think the answer is that there is no serious, reputable cost-benefit analysis done of the Olympic Games. It's exactly as you say. There are simply cases manufactured to justify decisions that have already been taken, and all kinds of spurious things are tossed into the pot to make the figures look good. There's a perfectly ridiculous report by the department, one government department a couple of years ago, which estimates benefits of between 28 and 40 billion pounds. But they've thrown all kinds of things into the pot which don't belong there at all. And as far as I can see, there's simply no serious analysis whatsoever. The National Audit Office, the public spending watchdog, when it comes to the Olympic Games, it seems to have just rolled over on its back for someone to tickle its stomach. It says, it produced a report in 2013 which said that on any reasonable measure, the Games must be judged to have been a huge success. So clearly excluding from reasonable measures a sort of serious cost-benefit analysis of the whole operation, but quite extraordinary, really. And the government seems to publish the data on the costs and benefits in this thing so as to make it as difficult as possible for anybody to evaluate precisely what's gone on. So I'm completely with you, sir, on this question. But I shouldn't consume our valuable time. I've returned to our panel again. Shall we take our...
I suppose
Neale.
it is often called the dismal science, isn't it? But I'm picking up your point about psychic energy and so on. I think that's actually absolutely right, and I think it actually works the other way as well. I mean, it's very beneficial to us to have, in arguing the cases that we're making all the time for further investment, whether that's particularly with private companies and whatever, that feel-good factor still hangs around Stratford and really has a big impact on the discussions we're having. So I absolutely agree with you that those things do hang together a bit, and it is a bit intangible, but we do see it all the time in discussions we have, particularly with investors who wouldn't have come near the place before the Games and before the success of the Games. I think in terms of young people, and that is a big challenge for us. I mean, we obviously do run a lot of programs around this of varying sorts. We're running some big apprenticeships campaigns. I was very pleased that, when we did the work on the transformation program, we had more apprentices on our site than any other site in London. I think there's some real challenges about not just aiming at skilling people for entry-level jobs, about making people, about working with people who are in the workplace. I mean, if you look at BT Sport and the people who are working there at the moment, and BT are very conscious about this, trying to get local people into most of the jobs that are in their studios is not at all straightforward. The community colleges, the FE colleges, Birkbeck themselves, but particularly the FE colleges, I think, are very innovative in that part of town. Hackney Community College has done a terrific job with the UTC. It's set up at Shoreditch, and it's now going to be in the broadcast centre. We're still investing very heavily in the type of job brokerage approaches that were successful in getting young people into the jobs at Westfield, and we're investing in other similar projects. It isn't easy, and it is a cause for concern that the Canary Wharf style effect, where actually an awful lot of the employment opportunities that were created there, plainly, I mean, it used to be said that there were more people working there who lived in Richmond than lived in Tower Hamlets. I don't think it was actually true, but there wasn't much done to, in the early years of Canary Wharf, to support local people to develop the skills, either to get into entry-level jobs there or to get into higher-level jobs, and we do need to keep working at that. There's a lot of commitment to do that, and it is the acid test in an awful lot of these projects, the extent to which a regeneration does deliver real benefits for local people, as opposed to others who don't necessarily come from those areas, and we're conscious of that. We work at it as best we can.
If I could just make a comment on your comment on the National Audit Office. I think there might be some confusion there. The National Audit Office looks at, a year after each Olympics, looks at the 4-year cycle of the elite sport funding programme carried out by UK sport. And each year they look at basically the cost of medals. How many, and what they were saying possibly in that 2013 report.
It was on the Olympics.
It wasn't, yes, it's on the Olympics. The National Audit Office produced a report each year on the funding policy from 2008 to 2012, aimed at generating medals. And basically, nobody expected Great Britain and Northern Ireland to get quite as many medals as did London. Beijing was a shock, because we achieved in Beijing what we're aiming to achieve in London. And therefore, the real worry was, how can you outdo Beijing? But they even outdid Beijing by a phenomenal amount. So it could be that comment could be related to that part of the National Audit Office element. And I think it was the most, what that has proved hugely successful in generating medals from 1996 when there was none, and we had 1 gold medal, Steve Redgrave. So I think there is a success in that side of the Olympics. But when we're coming down to, can you justify 9.3 billion? The answer is probably no. In straight economic terms, the answer is probably no. But if you take everything together, your remembrance of what happened on that Saturday night, and everybody's remembrance. I show a film at some of the lectures I gave, and I struggled to stop crying when I see some of those Olympic medals being rerun again, even though I've seen this film 12, 15 times. But I still get the emotional impact. And I think it is basically an emotional and political decision. Do we want to host the Olympics? Do we want to host the World Cup? For most other events, it doesn't involve all this huge amounts of expense. The events we study, European Championships, World Championships, in sports, it's normally European Championships in swimming. It's held in a swimming pool that's already there. The national teams pay for their own athletes to come along, put them all up in a hotel, they all spend money in the city, and there's a clear economic impact, a clear economic benefit. It's only those 2 events, the World Cup, to a lesser extent the Olympics. The Olympics are the most expensive because you have to build everything. Even the World Cup, if we'd have got it in 2018, we've got the stadiums already. We'd have to tinker with them, but nothing like the Olympics. So I think sport is an emotional activity. If you want to be part of sporting achievement, it is an emotional decision. It's not an economic one. And I'm glad we had the Olympics. I'm glad that that's the last Olympics I'll ever see in my lifetime. And I was very, very proud. And I think it has to be done on these more general terms. In economic terms, purely economics, the answer would always be no for these big events.
It seems to me that the economic analysis of mega events hasn't really massively moved on since the first time I looked into it, from the outside, I should say, in the 80s, when there was a sense in which people were kind of inventing techniques to talk about costs and benefits and so on in a very arbitrary way, case by case. And I'm not hugely sure it's changed greatly since those days. Mega events are a challenge to the discipline, seems to me. And they do require that things outside of economic factors, we've talked about culture, we've talked about the social dimensions, things like this, need to be brought in and somehow quantified and brought into the analysis. And that's even more the case if we're taking the idea of legacy seriously. Why? Because that changes the time frames, doesn't it? Because instead of just talking about the stay-away factors that affect mega events in terms of the impacts on tourism, which in the short term can be quite consequential, they maybe weren't so bad, or they were perfectly noticeable in the London case, but it's shifted into a very positive story since that time. But that's very short-term thinking about those impacts. We need to be thinking clearly in legacy terms in much longer time frames. And to do that analytically seems to me a challenge. And I don't see at the moment a great deal of academic debate and analysis to help us make these better informed decisions about these longer term implications and impacts.
So I think combining social and economic is, I think they should combine. The image of Stratford your image of Stratford changes, other people's image changing. You would expect over a long period of time that to be reflected in land values, in house prices, and therefore an economic benefit. That's why it's probably too early to say whether there's been whether the investment of 9 billion has realised that economic benefit. So I think there are overlaps and they do contribute to each other. And so the image of Stratford has changed and will have an economic benefit. Whether alternative... Well, I come back to your question about, was it 30 to 40 billion? So I think,
this is
as one of the authors of the report, I might respond.
Yes.
So I think this was a serious attempt at doing, it's called the meta-evaluation of the 2012 legacy. And it's a serious attempt to look at the costs and benefits of everything outside, around the games. And I think we did a study for 3 years, and we had lots of evaluations, academics, leading UK academics. And a meta-evaluation is a sense of bringing together all evaluations into one, so a meta-evaluation. The struggle we had that in the recession, all government bodies stopped doing their evaluations. And so therefore our evidence base collapsed because of funding of government. So we had far few evaluations in which to pull all the evidence together. But I think we have made a reasonable attempt at doing a cost-benefit analysis of the Olympics. And as I said, it's too early to say whether it's been a positive impact because of these long-term economic benefits, which will take decades to come through, 10, 20, 30 years. But if you have several hours or several days, I commend you to read it. It's 1,000 pages, 1,000 pages long. What I would say is the DCMS did pull out an awful positive spin on the whole thing, which is probably what you read, about all the positive messages from the Olympics, and why wouldn't they? So that's my feeling of how that went.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, now the time for questions, I'm afraid, has run out. Perhaps I could just be allowed one observation, though, which is to say that for all its faults, the dismal science does allow you to put into the cost-benefit analysis the psychic, non-pecuniary, non-monetary benefits that people feel. I mean, if the Olympic Games give everyone a warm glow of happiness that's lasted years and years, for which they would have been willing to pay hundreds and hundreds of pounds each, that's absolutely fine. You can put that legitimately into the equation as one of the benefits. You can't put in, however, lots of the other stuff, which was thrown in, endless measures of tourism and inward investment and goodness knows what else that were tossed into the pot. But it would have been entirely legitimate to put in some figure on the psychic non-money benefits that people felt. So the dismal science isn't as, unremittingly dismal as people thought that Thomas Malthus made it out to be. Anyway, I think we've had a very interesting discussion. I thank very warmly our panelists, Stephen Gifford, Chris Grattan, and Maurice Roach for their very valuable contributions, and in particular, I thank our speaker, Neale Coleman, for his excellent speech this evening. And you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your questions and comments. If you've enjoyed this as an enormous conference,